I will be preaching from our gospel lesson, that's John chapter 9, verses 1 through 41. If you get nothing else from this sermon, please get this. Jesus calls the people that we think are incomplete. Jesus calls the people that we think are incomplete. I think John chapter 9 is one of the funniest chapters in the whole Bible, actually. I think it's just hilarious if you read it, and we don't read it like it should, I think, and so you kind of got to hear it like a Mel Brooks comedy, right? That's kind of what this is. So, our story opens up and the disciples see a blind man. And they ask this question, which is not all that unnatural for us to ask today. Jesus, who sinned? Did this man's parents sin, or did he sin that he was born blind? Whose fault is it? Whose fault is it that he's a blind man? Surely somebody's at fault. Surely somebody did something. Isn't that how it works? We all like to believe in karma, right? Surely it's somebody's fault. Surely his parents worked some great evil, or he was going to be greatly evil. Surely something happened. You ignore the rest of the sermon, but you pay attention that Jesus dismisses that idea out of hand. He basically says the Bible version of, well, that's a silly idea. Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. It's not because they sinned that he was born blind. Jesus said, if you're looking for a reason at all, the only reason is that God's works might be done. After that point, this is when the comedy starts. I just love this. I just love all these little details in this story. So Jesus makes mud on the ground with his spit, and then he puts the mud on the guy's eyes and says, go wash in the pool. And then he washes, and suddenly he can see again. And everybody around him keeps trying to say, is this the guy? Is this the guy who was born blind? And he's right there the whole time, and I like to imagine him jumping up and down going, yeah, it's me. And they're debating, as he is right there, whether he's the man. They bring this guy to the Pharisees, and the Pharisees asked, well, where's the guy who healed you? And he goes, I don't know, because he was blind. He didn't know where Jesus went. He was blind, folks. They still can't believe that he's anything more than a blind man, though. So they take him to his parents to try and prove that he is not a blind man, and they go up to his parents and go, is this your son who was born blind? How can he see? They weren't there. How were they supposed to know? So they say, well, he's of age, ask him, kind of throwing their son under the bus. Thanks, Mom and Dad. So they ask him a second time, they basically interrogate him, and they go, how did this all happen? And I'd like to imagine at this point the guy's getting a little sarcastic. And he goes, well, I've already told you. Do you want to become his disciples? That's when the Pharisees really start seeing red, right? I'd like to imagine it's with sarcasm in his voice after the Pharisees say, we don't know where he comes from. This guy says, here's an astonishing thing. It's hilarious. It's a funny story. Here's what's interesting about this story, though. You know, we like to call this story a healing. If you look at your Bibles, a lot of them say the healing of the blind man, or it'll talk about spiritual healing or spiritual blindness. But it's a healing story. That's how we label it. But you know what? The word heal or made whole is not used in the entire story. Do a word search. You won't find the word heal anywhere in these 41 verses. And that's because I don't think it's really a healing story. It's not really about healing this guy's blindness. What it is about is that Jesus is calling this guy. He's calling this guy to be a disciple. Notice the pool that he sends him to go. This is a little detail, but it's really important. He tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam in verse 7. And then John tells us that Siloam means sent. That's what disciples do, right? They're sent. That's what we do every Sunday. I send you out into the world in order to proclaim the good news. This guy has been called by Jesus to be a disciple. He is called. And the hard part for this guy is that the world around him can't see him as anything other than the blind guy. Right? The world around him can't see him as anything other than blind. The disciples looked at him at first, and all they could do is turn him into a theology problem. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? That's all he is. He's a blind man to them. Theology problem to be solved. And his neighbors can't refer to him in any other way other than the guy who was born blind. That's all he is. He's the blind guy. He's incomplete to them in some way. He couldn't see. He's missing something. That's all he is, and that's all they can see him as. He's this person who's incomplete or missing something. They can't even use his name. Was this the guy who was born blind? I passed him 100 times. I never probably asked him what his name was. He was just always that blind beggar, and that's all he was to me. For the Pharisees, it's even worse. He's a problem to be judged, right? What do you mean you were healed on the Sabbath? How were your eyes opened? They can't see him for anything other than how incomplete he is. They can't see him for how he's missing something to them. And that's the terrible truth about us, too. The terrible truth is that there are people in this world that we can't help but see them as incomplete in some way or missing something. We define people by what we think they're missing, right? Oh, that poor person. Oh, that criminal. We define people by what we think they're incomplete or they're missing. We define people by the problem that we think they have. But we refuse to see the person. The good news, the wonderful news, the God-blessed news is this. That Jesus calls every person we think is incomplete or missing something. Jesus calls this blind man and he sends him out into the world to proclaim the good news. He calls him and he opens his eyes and he sends him, gives him mission again. And this is the guy who everybody thought was just a blind man, a guy who everybody thought was incomplete in some way or missing something. Those are the people whom Jesus calls, and it's who he's been calling the whole time, by the way. If the disciples were a little brighter, they would have picked up on this. Because after all, that's exactly the people that are gathered around Jesus. It's a bunch of not all that bright fishermen that Jesus has called, and it's who Jesus calls now. We are a gathering of people that the rest of the world wouldn't think very much of, and that's exactly who Jesus' disciples are every week, every day. And he calls us even when we think we're incomplete in some way, right? This is true. We think about ourselves that we're missing something, that we can't do it. We think that we're incomplete or missing something, that we're not whole, that we're not exactly who Jesus made us to be, and so God can't possibly call us. We define ourselves by our problems. We think Jesus can't at all be calling us to be disciples. And the wonderful, God-breathed, wonderful, amazing news, had to use wonderful twice, is that Jesus calls every one of us, even though we think we're incomplete or missing something. So that brings us to the question of the sermon. It's always really helpful when the Bible text has a question in it, because then I can just ask you the question that I was asked when I read it. It comes in verse 27. Do you want to hear it again? Do you want to be his disciples too? Do you also want to be his disciples? I don't think this guy is asking that question to be sarcastic. I actually think that's the one genuine moment in the whole story. I don't think he's being sarcastic. I don't think he's kidding. I don't think it's a joke, as much as the rest of the story is. I think he's genuinely asking that question. Do you want to be his disciples also? Now, to be clear, we're all gathered here and we all probably want to say yes to that question. But if we say yes to that question, then we need to be prepared for the hard part. And the hard part is that Jesus calls the very people we think are problems, or the very people we think are incomplete, or the very people we think are missing something. That's who Jesus calls. That's who Jesus gathers. That's who Jesus sends out into the world. And if we want to be Jesus' disciples, then those are the people we listen to and we are in community with, and the people that we let lead us. Do you want to be his disciples also? So perhaps, just perhaps, that person who is younger than you, who is asking for the church to change, and you kind of think is naive and just not experienced enough, perhaps they're not a problem, perhaps they're not incomplete, perhaps they're not missing anything, perhaps they're simply asking you the same question the blind man is. Do you want to be his disciples too? Or perhaps that person who is routinely asking for a handout and asking for help, perhaps that person isn't a problem to be solved or a person to be put somewhere. Perhaps that person is just asking you the same question that this man who was born blind is asking. Do you want to be his disciples also? Perhaps those voices from people who are of a different race or sexuality than us, who are demanding justice and inclusion, aren't just there to cause trouble or a problem to be solved. Perhaps they are just asking the same question that the man born blind is asking. Do you want to be his disciples also? We call this story a healing story, but the truth is that the word heal is never used. It is a call story, though. It's a story about how Jesus calls this man to discipleship and sends him out into the world. And it's a man that everybody else, from the 12 apostles to the religious leaders to the entire community around him, it's a man that they can't help but see as a problem. They can't help but see him but any way other than blind. And yet that is the exact person that Jesus calls and the exact person that Jesus sends out into the world. And the exact person who comes to us with just one question. Do you want to be his disciples too? Amen.